The US government hid this about the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a complex and protracted conflict that took place from 1955 to 1975, primarily between North Vietnam, supported by Communist allies, and South Vietnam, supported by the United States and other anti-communist nations. It was a pivotal event in modern history that had far-reaching consequences both for Vietnam and the global political landscape. The main causes of the Vietnam War were rooted in the country's struggle for independence and the broader geopolitical context of the Cold War. Vietnam had a long history of resistance against foreign rule, and after World War II, it sought independence from French colonial rule. The Geneva Accords of 1954 temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, creating North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh and the Communist forces, and South Vietnam, under President Ngo Dinh Diem, supported by the United States. The United States' involvement in Vietnam escalated during the 1960s as part of its Cold War policy to contain the spread of communism. The US feared that if South Vietnam fell to the Communists, it could lead to a domino effect in the region, with other countries in Southeast Asia falling under Communist influence. This policy, known as the domino theory, influenced the US decision to provide military and financial aid to South Vietnam. As the conflict intensified, the US sent troops to Vietnam to support the South Vietnamese government. The American military presence grew from a few thousand advisors in the early 1960s to over 500,000 troops at the height of the war in 1969. The war's tactics, including heavy bombing campaigns and the use of chemical defoliants like Agent Orange, had devastating effects on the Vietnamese population and the environment. As the war dragged on, opposition to the US involvement grew both in Vietnam and back home in the United States. Protests and anti-war movements escalated, and the war became increasingly unpopular. The Tet Offensive of 1968, a large-scale offensive by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, further eroded public support for the war. One aspect that the US government hid about the Vietnam War was the true nature and extent of its involvement and the realities on the ground. For years, the government provided optimistic and often misleading information to the American public about the progress and potential success of the war. The credibility gap between the government's statements and the actual situation in Vietnam contributed to growing distrust and disillusionment among the American people. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, were a classified government study that revealed a pattern of deception and concealment of information regarding the war. The papers exposed the government's knowledge that the war was unwinnable and that the US had escalated its involvement despite this awareness. This revelation further fueled public opposition to the war and added to the push for its eventual withdrawal. In 1973, the US signed the Paris Peace Accords, effectively ending direct military involvement in Vietnam. The last US troops withdrew in 1975, and the war concluded with the fall of Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, to North Vietnamese forces, leading to the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. The Vietnam War had a profound impact on both Vietnam and the United States. Vietnam faced years of reconstruction and social healing, while the US experienced deep divisions and reflections on the consequences of military intervention. The war's legacy continues to shape international relations, foreign policy decisions, and public perception of military engagements to this day. Certainly. Let's delve deeper into some key aspects of the Vietnam War. Guerrilla warfare. One of the defining features of the Vietnam War was the Viet Cong's use of guerrilla tactics. The Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla force based in South Vietnam, employed hit-and-run tactics, booby traps, and ambushes to frustrate and weaken the much larger and better-equipped American forces. Their ability to blend in with the local population made it challenging for US troops to identify and engage them. My Lai Massacre. One of the darkest chapters of the war was the My Lai Massacre, which occurred on March 16, 1968. American soldiers from the Charlie Company killed between 347 and 504 unarmed South Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and elderly people. The incident shocked the world when it came to light, further eroding support for the war effort. Anti-war movement. the Vietnam War sparked one of the most significant anti-war movements in U.S. history. People from diverse backgrounds, including students, civil rights activists, and religious leaders, protested against the war's continuation. These protests were often massive and contributed to a shifting public opinion that called for an end to U.S. involvement. Draft and draft dodging. The U.S. government relied on the draft to recruit soldiers for the war effort. Many young men were conscripted to serve in the military, leading to widespread resistance and draft dodging. Some young men chose to flee to other countries or claimed conscientious objector status to avoid military service. Impact on veterans. The Vietnam War had a profound and lasting impact on the soldiers who fought in it. Many veterans faced physical and psychological trauma, including post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Sadly, returning soldiers often faced a lack of support and understanding from society, making their reintegration into civilian life challenging. Legacy of Agent Orange. The widespread use of the herbicide Agent Orange by the U.S. military had devastating consequences for both Vietnamese civilians and American soldiers. The chemical caused numerous health issues, birth defects, and environmental damage that continue to affect generations to this day. Vietnam's aftermath. After the war's conclusion, Vietnam faced significant challenges in rebuilding its society and economy. The war had left the country deeply divided, and reunification was a complex process. The government implemented economic reforms and gradually opened up to international trade, leading to Vietnam's economic growth in subsequent decades. Diplomatic and political consequences. The Vietnam War had significant diplomatic repercussions, affecting relations between the U.S. and other nations, particularly those aligned with the Soviet Union and China. The war also influenced U.S. foreign policy, with policymakers adopting a more cautious approach to military intervention in the future. In conclusion, the Vietnam War was a complex and multifaceted conflict that left an indelible mark on the world. It revealed the limits of military power and the importance of understanding the historical, cultural, and political context when engaging in foreign conflicts. Decades later, the war remains a somber reminder of the human cost and consequences of armed conflict.